Masters of Seduction by Laura Adrian, Donna Grant, Laura Wright, and Alexandra Ivy. Narrated by Erica Rapson. Merciless, House of Gravory by Laura Adrian. Chapter 1. A gust of hot wind and fine rust-colored sand twisted like a dervish in front of Devlin Gravory's hard-set face as the hatch of his private jet opened and he prepared to disembark from the long flight. When he'd awoken that morning, he could not have guessed that before day's end he would find himself hours away from his island citadel in the Adriatic Sea, arriving at this small desert airport in a forbidding corner of the Middle East that had once, long, long ago, been known as Mesopotamia. Then again, when he'd begun his day, Dev had no idea that his brother had been killed. The shock of it, the piercing grief, clung to him as it had the first moment he'd learned the news. Golden, charming Marius, dead. Murdered. Dev's fists clenched as the memory of what he saw earlier that day filled his vision. Marius and a human woman, both nude, sprawled together in tangled white sheets that were soaked with sweat and semen and a terrible pool of their combined blood. The woman had been stabbed through the heart, a certain instant death for any mortal. Marius would have been harder to kill. Just shy of 400 years old, he had been younger than Dev by several centuries, but no less formidable. They were incubi, a demon race that fed on sexual energy and had existed for as long as heaven and hell had been at war over the souls of mankind. Devlin and his brothers of the House of Gravory, and every incubus in the 9 other houses of their race as well, were something ancient and dark, close to immortal. There were few ways to slay one of their kind, and fewer individuals who would dare. Whoever had sliced open Marius's throat in the midst of his sexual feeding last night had been aware of one of the surest methods. If Dev had to guess, the slayer had taken advantage of Marius at his weakest moment, attacking from behind as the incubus was having his carnal fill of his thrall. The human female had been slain with equal stealth and precision, no doubt while Marius was bleeding out. His big body slumped across her from the waist down. The woman had been pinned beneath his dead weight on the bed. A deep puncture wound had gaped at her breast, her fair skin sticky and dark with her life's blood. The killings had been expert, and nothing if not thorough. Except for one telling flaw. Dev carried that evidence on him now, to an unannounced confrontation on what had forever been sacred neutral ground. Scraping a hand over his short black hair, he headed down the Gulfstream G650's stairs in his charcoal gray, custom-tailored Italian suit and gleaming leather shoes. He hadn't bothered to change into more appropriate attire for this meeting. If the trappings of the outside world offended, Dev didn't give a damn. He'd been called directly from his corporate office to the crime scene that morning, then had been en route to this swath of arid, heat-choked land within the hour. Ironic that the lofty audience he sought now should be hidden in a place as hellish as this. He muttered a curse. Nasty words, spoken in the ancient language of his demon ancestors.
"It's not too late to turn back, Dev."
The calm, deep voice belonged to Ramiel, the captain of the House of Gravory's watchmen. The dark-haired bodyguard deplaned along with Dev, dressed in black pants and a fitted black t-shirt that clung to his broad chest and massive biceps. Elaborate tattoos declaring Ram's house affiliation and profession wrapped the incubus guardian's forearms. Ram shared Dev's bloodline, a distant cousin, but as loyal as any brother. And the watchman was cool-headed and steady, where Gravory's master was apt to strike hard and without warning at the first sign of attack. Like the scorpion that had been the sigil of the Gravoris for eons, Dev's wrath was swift, blinding, utterly merciless. It had earned him the nickname Devil Gravori, a reputation that followed him in both his business dealings and in all other areas of his life. Today, he was prepared to demonstrate the full force of that reputation in one of the most hallowed courts of the immortal realm.
"You don't have to do this,"
Ram went on.
"Not like this."
"The hell I don't," Dev snarled. The sight of Marius's killing was still raw in his mind. Every detail would be burned into his memory forever. Grief raked him, but it was fury that had put him on the plane and sent him here with a thirst for vengeance. In the chest pocket of his suit coat, the errant object Dev had retrieved from beneath his brother's body felt like ice resting over his heart. "No one crosses the house of Gravori with impunity. Not even them." He stared forward, refusing to slow his pace, let alone reconsider where he was heading. Ramiel grimly strode alongside him, across the sun-baked dirt tarmac, where a local driver and an off-road SUV waited. The vehicle had been hired to take them deeper into the desert, toward a ridge of jagged, haze-shrouded mountains that loomed like a dragon's spine in the sweltering distance. The driver wouldn't be able to deliver them the entire way. The place Dev needed to go would not be found on any map or road or shepherd's path. For the last leg of his journey, to enter the neutral ground of the Nephilim court, Dev would need to rely on demon magic to transport him. And hope to hell that same demon magic would get him out again when it was over. When they reached the idling SUV, Ram paused. The watchman's face was grave, filled with dread and doubt.
"Confronting the three simply isn't done, Dev. You know that. They are the balance. They have the power to enforce Nephilim law. They have the ear of the Sovereign as well."
"The Sovereign," Dev grunted. "It's been more than 500 years since the Council awarded the Obsidian Throne to the House of Mirakel. Since then, things between the Nephilim and the other incubi houses have been anything but balanced. If you ask me, we'd all be better off if we cleared the decks and started over, beginning with the incubus seated on the throne." Ram exhaled an oath, low under his breath.
"For fuck's sake, Dev. First you fly out here determined to demand an audience with the most powerful Nephilim in the realm, and now you stand here talking about treason."
Dev shrugged.
"Change is coming, just not soon enough for my liking. The three are due to step down in a handful of years, and if Mirakel does not produce an incubus heir before long, his house will die out the same way Akanas did."
Ram gave him a dubious look.
"Yes, and in the meantime, the three can, and will, do whatever they please, all in the name of peace. If you won't listen to reason, then at least let me stand with you in front of them today. As captain of Gravori's watchmen, I'm sworn by blood and steel to ensure your neck stays intact."
"They wouldn't dare," Dev assured him. Ram's answering gaze was sober.
"Tell that to Marius."
Dev didn't appreciate the reminder, even though the warning wasn't without merit. But he wasn't about to let anyone stand between him and the trio of Nephilim priestesses whose hands, he was certain, were somehow stained with his brother's blood. Ram may have pledged his life to Devlin as the master of the House of Gravori, but Dev's presence here was personal. And if it turned into a battle, he'd be damned before he let anyone else fight it for him.
"There are worse things than death," Ram murmured. "Prison and torture in the oubliette, for one."
Although the watchman was right about that, Dev dismissed the thought of the infamous supernatural prison with a hissed curse. "I can't let Marius's death go unchallenged, Ram," he said, his tone permitting no further argument. "Someone needs to answer for my brother's slaying. Someone needs to pay, blood for blood." Dev's hand came up to the place where the proof of his suspicion rested, cold against his heart. "I won't leave here without collecting on this debt." Chapter 2. The audience with the three was about to end in tears and disappointment. Nahiri knew it, even before the Nephilim mother's chin began to quiver with emotion. The woman was on her knees in a reverent pose, her demure daughter beside her at the base of the broad marble stairs that led up to the elevated platform at the head of the temple's high chamber. At the top of the 8 polished marble steps, seated behind a tall screen crafted of pierced sandalwood painted with gleaming gold leaf, the trio of Nephilim priestesses presided, unseen, over the temple and all within it. Nahiri stood at the bottom right of the stairs. Like the mother and daughter seeking counsel, Nahiri was clothed especially for this chamber sanctuary, in an undyed linen tunic and pants, simple calfskin sandals on her feet. But strapped crisscross from shoulder to waist on both sides of her body were the woven leather sheaths that held the weapons of her station. Nahiri was a blade. More specifically, she was a temple blade, one of less than a dozen Nephilim warriors responsible for guarding the high chamber and protecting the three. Not that anyone had ever dreamed of doing them harm. To Nahiri and the other temple blades, to all Nephilim, in fact, the exalted three, being half human, half angel, were practically deities in their own right. For nearly 300 years, they had occupied this temple as supreme sacred advisors. Like the three who served before them, their lives were devoted in selfless counsel to the sovereign on the obsidian throne, and to the larger Nephilim and incubi populations that existed in secret alongside mankind in the outside world. The decisions and edicts of the three were intended to keep the ultimate peace, and to ensure harmony and balance between the Nephilim and the incubi, above all things. Unfortunately, for the mother petitioning the three today on behalf of her daughter, those decisions did not always align with the whims and wishes of everyone who was granted an audience in the high chamber. Nahiri stood motionless at her post as the Nephilim mother attempted to persuade the three to reconsider her request here today. "Your Graces, please, I beseech you. Each generation of my family has been chosen to send one of our daughters to the harem in her 20th year. Why not this time? Why not my daughter? It is an honor we have always accepted most humbly." "As you should," said one of the three. A mild but measured response drifting down from behind the obscuring screen. "Selection is an honor that cannot be requested or petitioned. It is a sacred duty that must be protected and preserved." Although she respected the Nephilim way of life, Nahiri was relieved that as a blade, she was ineligible for the harem. The idea of being sent away to breed with the incubi who visited the pleasure palace made her shudder inwardly. She'd heard enough tales of the incubi's insatiable, unholy appetites and overwhelming sexual power. She'd listened in appalled fascination to the stories some of the other blades told in the temple dormitory late at night. Stories they'd heard from Nephilim sisters and cousins on the outside, about all of the things rumored to go on within the silk-draped walls of the harem. Wicked, deviant things that made Nahiri's cheeks flush and sent heat pooling between her legs, even now. Awkwardly, she shifted on the soles of her feet, trying to ignore the unwanted stirrings of her body. As she moved, she felt her long black braids swing against her spine. Her perfect soldier's posture broken, Nahiri winced and hoped no one had noticed. Naturally, someone had. The shifting of her stance caught the attention of the temple blade posted on the other side of the high chamber staircase. The tall blonde Nephilim lifted a pale brow in Nahiri's direction, smugly noting the flaw. Of course, Felina would enjoy seeing Nahiri squirm. The two had been in a silent competition with each other from the moment they both arrived at the temple to train as blades at the age of 18. A decade later, they were still rivals. Felina's stunning beauty won favors from everyone who looked at her, but the blade was also a skilled fighter. though she was not quite as skilled, nor as disciplined as Nahiri. It was that slim difference that had won Nahiri the right side of the high chamber stairs as captain of the Temple Blades, while Valina stood as her second on the left. Even though pride was frowned upon in the temple, Nahiri couldn't help taking more than a little satisfaction in the position she had claimed through hard work and devotion to her duty. Spine erect, expression placid, she stood at attention as the Nephilim mother and her daughter were dismissed by the three and began to take their leave. The pair had barely made it to the arched double doors when the fine hairs on Nahiri's nape started to prickle. A stirring energy was gathering swiftly outside the chamber. The tall door swung open, admitting a startling burst of heat. It shot through the room, carrying with it a metallic punch of ozone that blasted into Nahiri's nostrils. Like the approach of a violent storm, the air turned electric. Then it came alive in the form of a man. A very large, menacing man. Incubus. Nahiri knew it even before the raven-haired demon materialized fully and lifted his dark head. His citrine gaze was narrowed, his stance aggressive, big hands fisted at his sides. Alarm rushed over the room like a flash fire. Nervous whispers and anxious murmurs hissed through the ranks of the other blades. One of the newer trainees let out a shriek. Only the three seemed unmoved by the intrusion. Not that the incubus seemed to notice. Nor did he care. His disregard was plain enough in the way he'd arrived, rudely disrupting the chamber. But his attire added further insult. Instead of dressing appropriately for an appearance on sacred ground, he wore clothing from the outside, from the world of man. Modern, sophisticated clothing that somehow made him seem even more foreign and savage in this place. The coal gray suit he wore outlined every broad line and muscled inch of his body. At his throat, a patch of smooth, tanned skin showed beneath the unbuttoned collar of his crisp white shirt, hinting at lazy days spent under the sun. Decadent, Nahiri thought disapprovingly. It didn't take much to imagine what she guessed to be a pampered, debauched lifestyle of sloth and pointless indulgence. She tried not to imagine anything more about the sex-feeding demon, least of all how he and his kind were gifted with the power to seduce even the most unwilling soul. She felt the depth of that power crackling in the air all around her as the incubus stepped forward, neither waiting for nor seeking permission from the three to approach. Nahiri settled her hands on her weapons as he stalked up the center aisle in arrogant, long-legged strides, his entire demeanor bristling with menace. Yet for all his arrogance and rudeness, he was handsome. She might even have been tempted to call him beautiful, if not for the savage scowl that knit his brow and twisted his full lips into a furious snarl. Even in rage, his face was arresting, brutal and fierce, full of hard angles and unforgiving lines. His was the kind of face that would have told anyone looking at him that he was something more than human. Something long-lived, darkly formidable. Something very dangerous, all the more so because of his enticing, rugged appeal. Judging from the many agog faces of her fellow blades, Felina included, Nahiri had to guess this was one incredibly powerful incubus. Hushed whispers drifted toward her from the other Nephilim. "Isn't that the master of Gravori House? Heavens save us if it is." "You know what they call him, don't you?" "Devil Gravori." He was nearly to the front of the chamber now. As captain, it was up to Nahiri to meet this oncoming threat and stop it. If need be, she would call every blade in the room to attack. She stepped directly into his path. "Come no farther." To her relief, her warning sounded steady, unrushed. She felt the weight of more than one pair of blade eyes on her as she alone moved in to confront the menace that had taken over the room. The incubus paused, but those ageless golden eyes were fixed on her in question, in piqued challenge. Nahiri didn't like the wicked gleam she saw in his gaze. It did strange things to her breathing, made her already racing heartbeat lunge into a harder tempo. That unsettling citrine stare made her feel examined from the inside out. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as if her every fear and doubt and sinful thought were being laid out for his perusal. Worse, it took all her focus to keep from losing herself in his eyes, and the wicked promise that seemed to burn in their depths. She didn't want to imagine what his kind could do to a woman, but it seemed that as soon as she thought it, pictures were already forming vividly, profanely in her mind. She and this man, this demon, twined around each other under the heat of a summer sky. She could practically smell the sun warming his naked, tawny skin. She could almost feel the erotic warmth of him under her fingertips, in her grasp, on her tongue, against every fevered inch of her body. And then it was his fingers roaming over her bare skin, his lips tasting every inch of her, his mouth devouring her with a carnal hunger that threatened to consume her. Enough! Nahiri cleared her throat and struggled to rein in her wandering mind. Was he doing that to her deliberately? Did an incubus master like him even have to try? He moved to step around her. Nahiri moved too. Chin lifting to meet his arrogant gaze, she closed her fingers around the hilts of her weapons. Unannounced visitors are not permitted in the temple. She could have the twin 10-inch daggers in her grip and poised for combat in a mere instant. Although she had never used the special blades to inflict harm on anyone, she wouldn't hesitate to use them now. She wouldn't hesitate to kill, if it meant protecting the three. They were her family, as close to family as she'd ever known, that is. Those golden eyes seared her. "I'm not a visitor," he growled, his voice dark and deep and powerful. She felt the vibration of it all the way into her bones. "And since I'm already standing here, consider my presence all the announcement anyone needs." A gasp went up from many of the other blades. No one had ever dared such a flagrant show of disrespect for the temple, nor, more importantly, for the three. Nahiri bristled. She drew one of her long daggers. "You must leave. Now." He glanced at the razor-sharp length of honed obsidian in her hand. One black brow quirked, nearly imperceptibly. Then his face hardened, and the dangerous twist of his mouth turned even more terrifying. He took another step, not so much toward the stairs now, but toward her, into her personal space, until there was hardly a hand's width between them. "You think you can tangle with me, little blade? I won't go down as easily as my brother, I promise you that," he snarled. She didn't know what he was talking about. She didn't know anything in that moment, except the mesmerizing spell of his penetrating gaze and the answering rush of arousal that ran up and down her limbs, making her skin feel too tight, utterly too hot to bear. All of the carnal images and wildly erotic sensations she'd felt a moment ago under his stare intensified now. She saw things, felt things, that her virgin mind struggled to comprehend, even though her untried body seemed eager for the education. Her heart raced. Her breath accelerated into soft, shallow pants as a keen ache began to bloom deep inside her. She moaned at the feeling, powerless to bite back her reaction to this intense need. She couldn't break free of his hold on her. All the worse, she couldn't even summon the will to want to break free. It was unbearable, both the yearning of her body and the humiliation of how effortlessly the incubus would be able to make her his thrall if he wanted. Her fingers began to go lax around her blade, almost to the point of dropping it. No, she wouldn't go down so easily either. Gathering what inner strength she could, Nahiri mentally pushed back at him with all her will. No! The ache eased up at once. She was still breathless, her nerve endings still smoldering, but at least she had some control of herself again. As for the demon, Devil Gravori, he cocked his head at her, studying her with more interest than she cared to acknowledge. The look was there and gone in an instant. Then he swung his head away from her and addressed the three directly. He stalked toward the stairs before Nahiri could stop him. No one stopped him. No one seemed inclined to move against him, not even Valina. Every female face in the room was transfixed on him, not in terror or horror now, but in some small measure of the same boneless compliance that he had inflicted on her. He had enthralled every blade in the room. And now his fury was fixed entirely on the trio of priestesses at the top of the stairs. "I've come here to demand an explanation from the three of you," he said, his voice booming in the heavy silence of the room. "I've come to demand justice for the offense that's been dealt to my family and my house." The silence of the three was staggering. Nahiri waited to hear one of them, any of them, react to the accusation in some way. Had he enthralled the powerful Nephilim priestesses as handily as he owned the rest of the high chamber? Finally, a voice filtered down from behind the tall screen. "This is an overstep even for you, Devlin Gravori." Devlin, Nahiri silently acknowledged, not Devil. Although she was getting a very good taste for how he might have earned the nickname. "You've been master of your house for many centuries," another of the three said. "Long enough to know that this temple is not a place for violence or accusations. This is a place of peace and mercy, of wisdom and counsel, and we three are merely the balance." "Fuck the three of you," he growled, more savage than ever. "And fuck your precious balance. My brother was killed last night, along with his human thrall. I'm not leaving until I have an answer as to why." He stalked for the stairs leading up to the three, and started taking them two at a time. Panic sent Nahiri into motion. She sped up beside him to head him off midway. Her obsidian blade was gripped lightly, but lethally in her right hand. The second was not even a moment out of reach of her other hand. "Stop," she commanded the powerful incubus master. "You have no right." His teeth flashed white behind the furious curl of his lips. "Don't I, little blade?" He slipped his hand into the inside of his suit jacket. Nahiri thought for certain he was about to retrieve a weapon of his own. And in a way, that's exactly what he did. "I found this under my brother's body today." He held out his hand, a length of gleaming black volcanic glass lying across his palm. His tone seethed with barely restrained rage. "Whoever killed him left it behind." It was a broken length of blade. An obsidian blade. The kind of weapon only a Nephilim warrior like Nahiri would carry. Chapter 3. Dev watched the temple blade's expression turn to shock as she looked at the broken length of obsidian in his hand. Smoky dark eyes widened in confusion, in total disbelief. Was she stunned by the killing, or by the idea that he held evidence of it? Dev couldn't be sure. "No," she murmured. A shake of her head sent the rope of her silky black braid swinging like a pendulum behind her lithe body. "No, that's impossible. No one carries a weapon like this. Only a Nephilim blade," Dev agreed. "And no blade would raise her weapon against anyone without the approval of this high chamber." He swiveled a hard look in the direction of the three. "Or on its direct command." He heard her sharp inhalation, felt her tension ratchet up tighter at his inflammatory charge. "You cannot speak to them that way. It's not done. It's not right."
It's not right that my brother is dead, damn it!
His sharp words echoed in the silence of the temple. He glared down at her.
It's not right that the coward sliced open Marius's throat and left him to bleed out while his lover was stabbed through the heart.
The Nephilim warrior stared at him, then, mute, hardly breathing under the blast of his rage. And despite the boiling fury and grief he felt over his brother's murder by one of her kind, he couldn't deny that this blade intrigued him. She was beautiful. Sable dark hair, fathomless brown eyes that seemed both innocent and ageless in the creamy, soft oval of her delicate face. But beauty alone meant nothing to Dev. He'd had the pleasure of a lifetime of beautiful women. Several lifetimes. This Nephilim pricked his interest for her courage, even more than her heavenly face and tempting body, which he noted with far too much interest was hardly disguised by the loose-fitting clothes of the temple. She had been the only blade in the temple who'd made a move to stop him. Impressive, though not completely surprising, given that she stood at the right of the stairs as the highest guard. Looking into her sober, determined face now, Dev would bet that she'd have been the first to step up no matter her rank among the other blades. This female was brave, stubbornly so. She was also strong-willed, the only Nephilim warrior in the temple to push back against his allure. He'd turned it on hardest for her, and yet she'd managed to hold on to her will. Barely. That stubbornness made the incubus in him rankle with a wicked urge. How far would he have to go to seduce her? How long would it take for him to make the pretty blade his thrall? Dev shoved the thought aside with a growl. His unholy nature, and the carnal needs that came with it, would have to wait for another time. Another woman. Refocusing on his purpose for being in the temple, Dev curled his fingers around the cold obsidian in his palm. He had come for answers. For an explanation of why Marius had been singled out for such savage attack, and which of the Nephilim warriors had dealt it. Dev had come for an admission of guilt from the three, for an apology, for vengeance if he didn't find any satisfaction in this chamber. He swung around to address the three on a snarl. I demand the truth. Did you send a blade to kill my brother? Quiet filled the vaulted cavern of the high chamber, and for a moment Dev doubted he would get any reply. Then, at last, a whisper of movement from behind the screen at the top of the stairs. A low murmur of voices from the three, before one spoke for them all. No such order was given, nor have we ever called for an incubus's execution. Dev scowled, doubt tasting like bile on his tongue. It was true. He couldn't think of a single instance when an incubus had been sought out and killed on the orders of the priestesses during their 300-year tenure. Banishment to the oubliette was more their style. And yet he sniffed a lie in their response. He held the proof of the lie in his hand. The sharp length of honed obsidian felt like ice in his grip. You're telling me the blade who took this weapon to my brother's neck did so of her own volition? Or, more incredibly, against the edict of this chamber? It would be unheard of. Neither likely nor even possible, given the Nephilim warrior's devotion to the three. A slow exhalation sounded from the priestesses hiding behind their flimsy shield. There was a wealth of disapproval in the heavy sigh, scorn in the brief silence that followed. This intrusion is unwelcome, Master Gravory, though no more than your accusations. Dev grunted, unfazed that they'd taken offense. Tell me why my brother was killed. If you feel a wrong has been unjustly dealt your house, we suggest you take it up with the Sovereign. The Sovereign, Dev scoffed. Anger flooded him at their attempt to dismiss him. You know damned well my request will never be granted. How many years has it been since anyone's even seen him? You have our answer. Short words, sharp with irritation. We are finished here.
Like hell we are, Dev seethed with outrage. He couldn't hold back the roar that erupted from his throat. He pulled his arm back, then let the broken obsidian dagger fly at the screen at the top of the stairs. It shattered against the wall of pierced painted sandalwood that stood between him and the three. They scrambled behind the screen, a chaos of panic. Dev relished their fear. Although he'd never laid eyes on them, he pictured three faces blanched with alarm, sandaled feet scuffing over the polished marble as the priestesses leapt for cover. "Blades!" one of them shrieked. "Nahiri, seize him!" Slender, strong hands clamped down around Dev's arm in that instant. A razor-sharp edge of cold obsidian rested in warning under his chin. He met the dark eyes that glinted with unswerving determination in the lovely face of the temple's highest guard. If he so much as flinched with harmful intent toward the three, this exotic beauty, Nahiri, would cut him open right where he stood. He didn't want to admire that about her, but damn if he didn't find her even more attractive when her dough-brown eyes were narrowed, her entire body vibrating with readiness to fight. She was level-headed, stealthy, lethal, Dev had no doubt. She didn't have to worry. As furious as he was, Dev wasn't going to assault the three. It was one thing to storm into the high chamber and demand answers. Quite another to strike against the Nephilim's most sacred beings. The incubi in the Nephilim realms had already come through one savage war centuries ago. He wouldn't be the one to start a new clash between their races here and now. But he wasn't leaving without some kind of satisfaction. "This is far from over," he warned them. "I will find out who killed my brother and why. I won't rest until I have those answers. And I promise you, the guilty will not be able to hide for long, no matter who they are." Dev glanced into Nahiri's determined, doe-eyed gaze. She was struggling to keep her dagger on him, fighting a desperate inner battle against the blast of sexual compulsion he trained on her now with ruthless intent. He gave her more than he had the first time. Her full pink lips parted on a moan as he flooded her mind and senses with arousal, with raking need. She was strong, but he was stronger. And he had no mercy in him. Only fury. Only grief and a need to make someone pay. Until the three were ready to admit their part in Marius's murder, Dev wanted them to feel some measure of loss, too. Dev wrapped his hand around Nahiri's wrist, guiding the weapon away from his throat with only the slightest effort. As he held her in his grasp, a dark thought took root. A wicked thought that caught fire in his blood, faster than he could rein it in. "Since this temple values its damnable balance so much," he growled, "it only seems fitting that I take something precious from you." One of the three sputtered in outrage. "You would not dare!" But he already had. With Nahiri held tight in his grasp and deep in his thrall, Dev dematerialized, taking the Nephilim priestess's most valued blade along with him. Chapter 4. Nahiri awoke in the middle of a large bed in a strange room. She shot upright the instant consciousness dawned, her hands reaching automatically for her weapons. They were gone. The leather sheaths that crossed her torso were empty. No, that meant her nightmare hadn't been just a dream. It was reality. The incubus in the temple, Devlin Gravory. He really had taken her. Nahiri's eyelids snapped open in panic. Sunlight poured in from an open window across the room, blasting her vision. Momentarily blinded, she squinted through her lashes, struggling to take quick stock of her new surroundings. Creamy stucco walls, dark hardwood floors and masculine-looking furnishings, thick timber beams high above her head. And beneath her, a massive bed. The mattress was as cushiony as a cloud,
the cotton sheets and silken coverlet calling to mind all manner of sins. All around her was the scent of intriguingly exotic spices and something even more enticing. Him. She sensed his presence even before she swung her head in his direction and found him seated in an upholstered chair beside the bed. No, not seated in it exactly. Dominating it. The same way he seemed to dominate every space he occupied. His big body lounged negligently where he sat, his powerful thighs spread, one arm draped over the side of the chair, the other propping his head up, fist curled loosely under the square line of his jaw. He'd shed his suit jacket at some point, and now wore just his gray tailored pants and white business shirt. The collar was opened even farther than she recalled, just one more button loosened, but exposing enough of his tawny skin to make her mouth water with a sudden, unholy urge to taste him. She wanted to dismiss the impulse as one he planted in her mind, but she could tell from the casual way he regarded her that any curiosity she felt in that moment was hers alone. Nahiri scrambled off the bed. She backed into the farthest corner of the room, eyeing him warily. "Where am I? Where have you taken me?"
"You're at Gravory House."
He cast a nonchalant look around the room.
"More specifically, you're in my bedroom."
Even though she could have guessed as much, her heart still climbed into her throat. Since she'd gone to the temple to train at 18 years old, she hadn't left the sanctuary grounds even once, let alone spent so much as a minute in a man's bedroom. She might be a virgin, but she had never been a wilting little girl. She was a grown woman, a skilled warrior. She refused to let him intimidate her. "It was a bad idea to abduct me from the temple," she informed him. "The three will see you punished for this, incubus, regardless of what you mean to do to me. And with or without my weapons, I am still a blade. I will fight you every step of the way."
"The same way you did in the high chamber?"
Her cheeks flamed with heat at the reminder, with humiliation. Her weakness had shamed her in front of the other blades, in front of the three priestesses who'd entrusted her with their lives, with her faith that she was the best, the strongest of her peers. And this demon had disproved all of that in a moment. He would do it again if he wanted to. He could do anything he wanted to her. Nahiri could see it in the hard glint of his golden eyes. No, for all her skill, for all her dedication to the teachings and trainings of the temple, Devlin Gravory could destroy her at his whim.
"I'm not interested in fighting you,"
he murmured, as if he could read the troubled direction of her thoughts. She swallowed, watching the way he stared at her from across the room. He didn't move, and yet her body trembled as though his hands were already on her, as hot and roaming as his gaze. All the wicked, deviant things she'd ever heard about incubi appetites poured over her in a rush of dread and terrible anticipation.
"In case you're worried about it, I'm not interested in raping you either," he drawled, the corner of his mouth curling around the sensual growl of his deep, rumbling voice. "Forcing a woman isn't the incubus way. Never been my way, at any rate."
Nahiri hiked up her chin. "No, you'll just bend my will until I submit, or make me your thrall so you can siphon my life's energy for your own. Maybe you'll manipulate my mind until I beg you to drain me completely. I suppose that would be more your way." He grunted, dark amusement in his tone.
"I have plenty of women more than happy to slake my needs. All of my needs."
As reassurances went, his did little to relieve her. He steepled his hands beneath his chin, his citrine gaze locked on her. Nahiri could hardly breathe. His dark energy was gathered about him, pulsating and vivid. But not the way she'd felt it in the temple. He was holding his demonic allure in check now, despite the heat she felt licking along her limbs and putting a flame to her blood. He intrigued her as much as he unsettled her. Heaven save her, but he tempted her. Even as he terrified her, infuriated her, he stirred a dangerous longing in her. And he knew. The way he studied her, he knew she was struggling against an attraction she wanted desperately to deny. One raven brow quirked nearly imperceptibly. If I wanted to take you as my lover, Nahiri, or feed from you as my thrall, I wouldn't need force or incubus magic to do it. The combination of her name on his lips and the terrible truth he spoke made her heart stumble in her chest. It beat shallowly, accelerating in time with her breathing, and she tried not to notice how his gaze tracked every inch of her body, settling on her breasts as they rose and fell with each rapid squeeze of her lungs. He got out of the chair and stood in place for a long moment. When he finally moved, his steps were measured, unrushed, so confident, as if doubt was something he never had to trifle with when it came to women. Of course, he'd told her as much, so his arrogance shouldn't surprise her now. Nahiri stood, frozen as he approached, his thick-muscled thighs carrying him in a slow prowl across the room. He paused an arm's length away from her. "Why did you bring me here?" she asked, grateful that the tremors of her body hadn't found their way into her voice. She could not forget for an instant that she was dealing with a demon. "What do you want from me?" His sensual mouth twisted in contemplation. "I haven't decided yet. But let me be clear about one thing, little blade. You may be pledged to the three in their precious temple, but in this house, I am master. So long as I have you under this roof, you will obey me. As of now, your well-being, your life, everything belongs to me." She bristled, outrage shooting through her like fire. She welcomed the anger. It helped eclipse the desire that was still simmering inside her, unwanted and never to be admitted, especially to this overbearing heathen of a man. Tevlin Gravori was mad if he expected her to think of him as anything but her captor. Her enemy. And he might as well realize that now. Nahiri peeled her lips back from her teeth in a furious smile. She squared off against him, ready to do battle even without the benefit of her weapons. "I would rather die before I give anything to you, willingly or by force. I would see you dead before that day." He scowled as she hissed the words into his face. When he raised his hand, she thought for certain he would strike her. Instead, his broad, warm palm came around the back of her neck. He held her in a firm grip and brought his face terrifyingly close to hers. When he spoke, his voice was raw, as rough as gravel in his throat. "Be careful with your threats, Nahiri. Those are dangerous words, particularly when my kin are already grieving the loss of one brother to your kind today." She stared up into his fierce golden eyes, transfixed by the power she saw there, by the pain and fury that hardened his handsome features and tightened the lush line of his mouth. "On the other side of this bedroom door, I have a dozen incubi brothers and cousins who might be tempted to take your threats against me to heart. They might be tempted toward other things, too. But not so long as you're under my watch. No one takes what belongs to me." As he spoke, his gaze drifted to her mouth. It lingered there, and suddenly Nahiri could hardly swallow for the lack of moisture in her throat. Her lips tingled under his gaze, aching for contact. Her temples pounded with her heartbeat, a rising steady thrum that seemed to echo in the small space between her body and his. Everything female in her was fixed on this man, this dark, deadly demon, and the unholy need he aroused in her. "You will obey me," he muttered, the command like velvet on her senses when it should grate like sharp stones. "As of right now, Nahiri the Blade, you belong to me." He wanted to kiss her. Holy fuck, He wanted to do a hell of a lot more than that with Nahiri, and he didn't trust himself to be alone with her for one more second the way his need was churning inside him. As an incubus, he thrived on pleasure. Sex was at the core of who he was. It sustained him the same way food nourished a human. But it wasn't physiological necessity he felt around the gorgeous Nephilim in his custody. It was lust, pure and simple. It was craving, deep and raw and all-consuming. He may have prided himself on never taking something from a woman that wasn't freely given. But his cock had other ideas where Nahiri was concerned. Very tempting, very carnal ideas. Which is why Dev found himself on the other side of his closed bedroom door, standing in the hallway with a massive heart-on and an attitude just short of hellacious. Ramiel came walking toward him in that moment, up from the other end of the hall. He stopped dead in his tracks as soon as he saw Dev's ferocious scowl. The watchman smirked. "Now tell me it wasn't a mistake to bring the woman here." Dev snarled a wordless reply. Ram had been incredulous when Dev had teleported out of the temple with an enthralled, unconscious blade in tow. He'd tried to convince Dev to rethink the impulse that made him grab Nahiri as some kind of collateral for the justice Dev sought for Marius's slaying. But Dev's mind had been made up. He couldn't let the three lie to his face on top of the murder he was sure they had a hand in. They had to feel some pain today, too. They deserved to weather some degree of loss. As for Nahiri, her only offense was having the bad luck to be standing in the crossfire of his wrath. Not that he had any sympathy for the blade. No, at the moment, sympathy was pretty damned far down the list of things he was feeling for her. He stepped away from the closed door to meet his watchman at the other end of the hallway. The two incubi headed downstairs to the main floor of Gravory House. "Shall I post one of my men to guard your prisoner?" Dev gave Ram a dark look. "That won't be necessary. She's not going to try to escape." "How can you be sure?" Ram glanced at him sidelong, brows raised in question. "What did you do? Threaten to dangle her pretty Nephilim arse like candy in front of every incubus in the Citadel? I can only imagine the feeding frenzy that would cause." The thought put a stab of violence in Dev's already dangerous mood. He glared at the captain of his guard. "No one will touch her, understood? No one. But she doesn't need to know that. All she needs to know is so long as she's in my keeping, she is at my mercy alone." Ram gave him a nod, but didn't seem able to keep from snorting a low chuckle. At the mercy of Devil Gravory. Does she realize that's even more dangerous than facing a pack of sex-hungry incubi? Dev grunted, leading the way through the living area of the sprawling Mediterranean-style villa. Most of the house was having lunch in the sun-filled courtyard outside, his brothers and cousins seated soberly around large tables set up on the tiled patio, while the Gravory children, a handful of incubi boys and a couple of Nephilim girls, offspring of the mated members of the family, played a raucous game of chase through the hedge maze in the gardens. Dev watched a tow-headed boy in particular. The 5-year-old leapt up onto a large rock with a jubilant shout. His face lit up with triumph as he declared himself the winner. A few of the other boys jumped to challenge, playfully toppling him, and off they went together in a cacophony of shouting and mock battle. "I take it Kai and the other children haven't been told about Marius yet." Ram shook his head. "Arian thought it best for you to tell the boy about his father's death first. Then he'll gather the other children and explain the situation to them all together." Dev glanced at his mated brother, the calm and steady one. There were times he felt Ari would have been better suited as master of Gravory House. He certainly had the better temperament, and the compassion required to rule. Although Ari had tried for the seat, it was Devlin who had won it instead. As for the rest of his brothers, Baynor, Nael, and Zabin, None had wanted the responsibility to lead, least of all Zabin. And if there was one incubus in the villa whom Nahiri needed to fear as much as Dev, it was the libertine black sheep of their demon clan.
"I'm surprised to see Zabin sticking around today," Dev murmured. "Not like him to linger when things get too dramatic around here."
Ram shrugged.
"Apparently even he is grieving Marius. Ari told me Zabin will stay until after the rites." "How noble of him," Dev grunted, his gaze clashing with that of his dark-haired younger brother, who saluted him grimly over a glass of blood-red wine. He looked away from Zabin without acknowledging him. In the garden, the children were still playing, laughing brightly. Dev glanced with regret at Marius's only progeny. The harem-born little boy's face was alight with glee, innocently unaware of the crushing news that awaited him. "Bring Kai to me after his game is over. I'll be in my study, making arrangements for tomorrow night."
Chapter 5. Nahiri didn't see her demon captor again the rest of that day or night. She'd avoided the tempting comfort of the bed, his bed, and had instead spent the night curled up on the hardwood floor, trying her best to keep from sleeping in case he decided to return to his bedroom and make good on any one of his disturbing threats. As much as she knew she should fear all of the incubi in this unfamiliar enemy terrain, it was Devlin Gravory who frightened her the most. Not because she dreaded what he might do to her. Because deep down, to her horror, she dreaded that what he'd said was true. If he wanted to make her his lover, he wouldn't have to resort to brute force or incubus tricks to persuade her. The words had haunted her all night. They were still heavy in her mind that next morning, when the bedroom door opened without a knock of warning, and in walked the arrogant, disturbingly attractive demon. If possible, his black scowl seemed even more dangerous now. Nahiri got to her feet, throwing her long braid behind her as she eyed him warily. His handsome face was more rigid today, his square jaw clamped tight, unforgiving. Deep lines scored the sides of his sensual mouth. Dark shadows rode beneath the startling canary hue of his eyes.
"You're up early. Good,"
he muttered, looking her up and down as he entered the room. He carried clothing folded neatly over his arm, something feminine by the look of it, the tropical blue fabric adorned with a smattering of tiny, delicate flowers.
"I brought you something to wear."
Nahiri smoothed her rumpled, undyed linen tunic and pants. "I have my own clothing." He didn't bother to acknowledge that, just stalked farther into the room and thrust the sundress at her.
"There's a shower and anything else you might need in the ensuite. When you're dressed, meet me downstairs."
Nahiri stared at him.
Meet him downstairs?
Why? Had he decided to throw her on the mercy of his incubi brothers and cousins after all? Was he telling her to shower and dress to face her executioners? Or worse? She had to know. "What's waiting for me downstairs?"
"I will be," he said. 15 minutes, Nahiri. No more. Or I'll come back and personally see that you do as I tell you."
He gave her no chance to argue, no chance to demand more information. Pivoting away from her, he was gone from the room in the next moment, shutting her in once more. Nahiri looked at the dress that was so different from anything she'd put on in the past 10 years. It was nothing she'd wear now either, and she wanted to despise the dress as much as the man who brought it to her. With thin straps at the shoulders and a skirt that flowed in a loose drape probably to her ankles, it was both sensual and modest. The fabric was soft and cool to the touch, probably silk. Nahiri held it up to her body, surprised to see it was just the right size. She didn't want to put it on. Nor did she want to leave the room and face whatever humiliation or torture he had arranged for her downstairs. But she refused to consider the alternative, having him return to make sure she obeyed his commands. His arrogance made her normally calm demeanor seethe. She was not his plaything. She was a blade, the right guard of the temple's high chamber. If Devlin Gravory wanted to lead her into some kind of judgment today, or some incubi means of degradation, she would walk into his wrath with her head held high. She showered and dressed in less than 10 minutes. It felt strange to leave the bedroom and make the trek down the long hallway by herself. In the villa below, the smell of food drifted. Smoked meats and fresh-baked breads, the citrus tang of oranges, the nutty aroma of brewing coffee. Nahiri breathed it in, more accustomed to the temple's pervading scents of hot sand and incense. Instead of waking to silent meditation, this place was busy with activity. A large group of people were gathered somewhere downstairs. Groups of men and women conversing, plates and silverware clinking, chair legs scraping over smooth tiles. Here and there, the bright chirps of children's voices. Nahiri inched her way down the stairs, peering into the heart of a lavish Mediterranean mansion. As she descended, the group gathered in the open-air courtyard stopped talking, everyone turning to look at her. A few of the men, large, imposing incubi, stood to glower in her direction. At the breakfast table, a pretty red-haired woman set down her utensils and motioned for 2 young boys to come to her side. She immediately pulled them close in a suspicious, protective stance. Protecting them from me, Nahiri realized, astonished to consider it. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know where to look or where to go. She felt even more uncertain wearing the long-skirted floral dress with her temple sandals instead of her blade's garb. The minuscule straps holding up the bodice felt no better than the thinnest threads as she stood before these people. Her bare arms raced with heat, then chills, making her feel exposed, self-conscious. She crossed her arms over her breasts, trying not to feel so awkward and afraid, so out of place and unwanted. "You finished sooner than I expected." Even though it sounded like an accusation, Gravory's deep voice was a comfort under the weight of so many unwelcoming stares. He came to stand in front of her, taking an unrushed measure of her appearance. His mouth tensed slightly, nostrils flaring nearly imperceptibly. When he met her eyes again, she saw a dark satisfaction in his, an unmistakable hunger. And whether or not he wanted to enthrall her, she could feel the caress of his preternatural allure. It reached out to her like a physical stroke. He moved closer, blocking her from the disapproval of these other people. His family, all of whom seemed to regard her as the intruder when it was she who had been forced here against her will. "Come with me," Gravory said. He started walking. This time, Nahiri was glad to obey him. She followed him through the courtyard, toward a stone path cut through a lush garden. When they were out of view of the gathering, Gravory paused and turned toward her, frowning. "Undo your braid." "Why?" Instinctively, she reached for the long tail that swung behind her with each step. "Because I asked you to," he said in low, sensual tones that conveyed something more than simple arrogance. "And because it reminds everyone here of what you are." "The enemy," she murmured. "Is that why you made me put on this dress, too?" He cocked his head as he made another slow appraisal of her from head to toe. "No. I made you put it on because I wanted to see you in it. Now, undo your braid." Maybe because her heart rate had just gone a bit hectic, Nahiri found herself slipping off the thin leather thong at the end of her braid. She speared her fingers into the woven strands and worked them loose all the way up to her nape. As her long black hair sifted around her shoulders and down her spine, Gravory's chest rumbled with a quiet growl. The air thickened as though a wave of heat had just rolled into the garden to twine around the both of them. "This way," he snarled, and set off once more. On the other end of the manicured bushes, flower beds and maze of tall greenery, A paved path led across the lawn to where a black helicopter sat on a concrete pad behind the estate. Emblazoned on the cockpit door was the symbol of a scorpion, painted in gold. The Gravory sigil. Each of the 10 incubi houses had their own symbol, their own totem that represented the family through the eons. Every Nephilim knew the sigils. For those Nephilim born of the harem, like Nahiri, their fathers were incubi, so the sigils were part of them too. Nahiri looked at Devlin Gravory, striding alongside her with grim purpose. Like his house totem, he was volatile and dangerous. He was fierce, unforgiving, and yet his hand came down gently on the small of her back as they reached the helicopter. A pilot sat at the controls. An incubus as well, Nahiri guessed, feeling her skin prickle with mild awareness of the demon. Although the flat look he gave her through the window might have been enough to tell her he was also a member of Gravory House.
"My brother, Nail," Devlin said as he opened the cockpit door to Nahiri.
The sandy-haired demon grunted, his expression unmoving. "Where are we going?" she asked. Gravory didn't answer. He gestured to the open door in the cabin within.
"After you."
Warily, she climbed up into the cabin and slid into one of the 4 bucket seats, the 2 pairs facing each other inside the small compartment. Gravory got in behind her and took the seat right next to her. After strapping her into the restraints, then fastening his own, he gave a nod to the pilot to take off. The engines whined, the propeller began to chomp, and the helicopter lifted up from the ground. Nahiri had never felt anything so extraordinary. She'd never seen the earth from above, had never realized how awe-inspiring hills and rock and trees could seem from so high off the ground. And up ahead, the ocean. It glittered, impossibly blue, sunlight twinkling like stars across the rippling surface. Nahiri pressed her face as close to the window as she could get.
"You've never flown before?"
Gravory's low voice sounded right up against her ear. She gave a small shake of her head, unable to summon words with him so close to her. She'd been so engrossed in the scenery, she hadn't realized he'd unbuckled his seatbelt and sidled up behind her. Now she was powerfully aware of him. His heat permeated the thin silk of her dress. His body's warmth skated over her bare arms, making an all-new liquid warmth bloom deep inside her. She tried to ignore the intensity of their close quarters, and the fact that the outside of his thigh was pressed up against hers as he leaned in beside her. His long, muscled arms caged her in on either side of the small compartment, one hand on the upper back of her seat, the other braced on the opposite side of the cabin. Nahiri wanted to ignore the way her pulse was hammering in her breast and in her temples, the way it was throbbing in the sensitive apex of her thighs.
"You know, the incubi have always envied your angel ancestors for their wings,"
he murmured, his mouth beside her ear. "The Nephilim, too," Nahiri said. She gazed in wonder as they soared over a verdant, hilly landscape. Neatly tended rows of vines combed the earth as far as she could see. And embracing the edge of the rolling green inclines and fertile brown tracts of soil was the breathtaking crystal blue water of the ocean. Being earthbound, I never understood why I should envy the angels. Until now. She made the mistake of turning slightly to look at him. His penetrating stare seemed to reach right into her eyes, into her soul.
"There are other ways to fly, Nahiri. You only have to be willing to let go."
His voice was velvet against her nerve endings, a temptation as overwhelming as his immense body, crowding her too intimately in the tiny compartment. His gaze dropped to her mouth and lingered there, making all the moisture evaporate from her lips. She swallowed, wanting desperately to think he was flexing his incubus powers of seduction on her. Anything to keep from admitting to herself how much she hoped he would kiss her. This man, this demon incubus, made her yearn for dark, dangerous things. And she wasn't alone in that yearning. She could read it plainly enough in his unflinching face. She could see it in his too serious expression that made her feel both wildly uncomfortable and recklessly bold. He lifted his eyes to hers. Then his fingers brushed tenderly along the side of her cheek, coaxing her face toward his. Nahiri knew she should draw away from his touch like she would an open flame. Instead, she couldn't even draw breath. Heaven save her. But there was nothing she wanted more in that moment than to feel his lips against hers. He leaned in closer, then closer still. A dark rumble vibrated through him, though whether it was a chuckle or a growl, she couldn't be certain. His hand fell away abruptly, leaving an empty chill on her cheek. "We're here," he said, a gruff announcement. He sat back in his seat, all the tenderness of the moment gone in an instant. Nahiri mentally snapped herself out of her daze to look out the window again. Below them, the green vineyards and rich brown soil stretched toward a compound of cream-colored buildings capped with red tile roofs. There was nothing else around for miles and miles. Nahiri shot a troubled look at him. "What is this? My new prison?" His mouth quirked, but his gaze was gravely serious. "This is the Gravory family business. I have matters to attend today, and I wasn't about to leave a blade in my home without me there." She sat back against the cushioned seat, watching as the helicopter gently descended to the ground outside the complex of buildings. After they landed, Nahiri reached up to unfasten the restraints. Before she could manage it, Gravory's hand came down atop hers. "The employees here are human. They don't know what I am, and I mean to keep it that way." He leaned toward her, no softness in his citrine eyes, or in the dark velvet voice that grazed her ear. "Whatever I say in there, I advise that you play along." Chapter 6. Heads turned as Dev walked into the Gravory Vineyards corporate office with Nahiri. It wasn't unusual for the female employees, and a few of the men, to pause whatever they were doing and look up in eager anticipation when he or any other incubus entered a room. The sensual allure of a sex demon was a powerful thing. It was a reaction Dev and his kind had learned to take in stride. So much so, he hardly noticed anymore. But today it was different. Today, the object of everyone's interest was the dark-haired, exotic beauty at Dev's side. He glanced at Nahiri and saw what the humans did in that moment. A tall, elegant goddess with absorbing, intelligent brown eyes and a tempting, sensual mouth, set in the delicate face of an angel. Maybe he should have thought better of making her wear the spaghetti-strap sundress with its plunging neckline. He'd sent Ram to the mainland last night to buy various supplies and told the watchman to pick up a few things for Nahiri to wear. Of the handful of garments Ram returned with, the tropical blue dress had immediately caught Dev's eye. He knew the body-skimming sexy dress would look spectacular against Nahiri's smooth skin and pleasing curves, and he'd been right. Damn, had he ever been right. The way the half-dozen human men in the room were gaping at her, Dev would have rather had her covered from head to toe in the shapeless undyed linen from the temple. One of the older women stepped around the reception desk to greet them. "Good morning, Mr. Gravory. And, your guest?" "Good morning, Louisa," he said, giving his capable general manager a nod. He sent a flat look and a tighter nod of greeting to the rest of the room, the men in particular. "This is Nahiri." Although he didn't have to say it, every male pair of eyes in the room blinked with understanding. This unearthly beauty was Nahiri, and she belonged to Dev. At least as far as any of them were concerned. He glanced back to Louisa.
Is everything ready for me?
Yes, Mr. Gravory. This way, please. He paused to let Nahiri step in front of him, gesturing her into motion with his palm at the base of her spine. He felt her sudden intake of breath at the moment of contact. The jolt of awareness, her little tremor of startled pleasure, vibrated against his palm, a sensation that stayed with him even after he'd drawn his hand away and fell in behind her. With pleasure, he followed her as Louisa took them through the old stucco and tile building that had been the headquarters of the Gravory family business for hundreds of years. It was impossible to walk behind Nahiri and not imagine what her long, lean legs would feel like wrapped around his waist. And seeing the tight curve of her backside made him instantly hard and hungry with the urge to mount her, to bend her over the nearest surface and ride her sweet ass until she was screaming his name for all to hear. Especially the men in the other room, who'd looked at her as if they were having similar thoughts. Dev felt a scowl crease his brow. He had no right to feel any such things, least of all the jagged edge of possessiveness that cut into him while he strode behind Nahiri toward their destination. She didn't belong to him, despite the threat he delivered yesterday in his bedroom. She belonged to the temple, to the three. She belonged to a race of beings he didn't trust and should despise for what had been done to his brother and the human Marius had taken up with. And yet, Dev craved this Nephilim blade. He wanted Nahiri with an intensity that shook him. Damn it, he should have kissed her in the helicopter and gotten it out of his system. Now, the question, the temptation, was going to hang over him all bloody day. And it wasn't going to be easy to pretend he'd brought Nahiri with him purely for the security of his house and family when he was stalking after her now, sporting a raging hard-on. "Here we are, Mr. Gravory," Louisa announced, pausing at an open doorway. "A bottle from each of our finest vintages, just as you requested." "Thank you," Dev murmured. He motioned for Nahiri to step inside the tasting room with him. Across the sunlit plank wood floor and antique Persian rug was a blood-red leather sofa and a large mahogany cocktail table where 10 bottles of red wine stood uncorked and waiting to be sampled. "That will be all, Louisa. I'll let you know when I'm finished in here." "Of course, sir." She smiled and obediently disappeared. Nahiri glanced at all the wine before looking back at him in question. "This was the important business you had to attend today?" "Wine has been my family's business for centuries. It's my passion." He cleared his throat. "One of them, at any rate. And yes, Nahiri, this is important." He closed the door behind them as she wandered farther into the room. Instead of sitting down, Nahiri drifted over to the large wall of windows that overlooked the sun-washed vineyards outside. "All of the vines we flew over are yours?" "Every last one of them." Dev joined her at the glass. "The entire island belongs to the House of Gravory. The winery and vineyards date back to Roman times." "It's lovely," she murmured. "And not what I expected." Dev stared at her. "I agree." Her gaze flew to his, her fine brows raised. Whatever she might have thought or said was lost when movement outside drew her attention back to the windows. "There goes your brother." "Nail, was it?" Dev grunted, following her line of vision. Nail strode toward one of the rows of vines. He wasn't alone. The incubus was hardly ever without female company, and Dev didn't have to guess what his sibling was up to now. "Isn't that one of the women we saw when we came in?" Nahiri asked. The words had barely left her lips when she glanced away abruptly. "He's taking off her clothing in broad daylight." "Yes," Dev replied. "Incubi don't have modesty issues. Apparently, neither does Nail's choice of thrall today." Dev watched only long enough to see Nail sling the half-naked, giggling young woman over his beefy shoulder and tromp off into the vines with her. When he looked at Nahiri, her cheeks were flamed pink. "Do you use the women here like that, too?"
"Never," he said.
But he had to admit a pang of envy for his brother, who took his pleasure anywhere and with anyone he pleased. If Dev were more like Nail, or most of his other brothers, Nahiri's cheeks wouldn't be the only part of her that was flushed with heat.
"I prefer to keep my business and personal lives separate," he told her. "Fewer complications that way."
"Your brother doesn't seem to care about any of that."
Dev shrugged. "Nail does what he wants. Marius did too."
"Your brother who died," Nahiri murmured.
"My brother who was murdered," he corrected.
With a gesture of his arm, Dev guided Nahiri to take a seat on the sofa while he poured them each a sampling from one of the bottles of wine. He sat down beside her and handed her a glass. She sipped at his direction, and Dev waited for a reaction. Although she didn't seem to dislike the wine, her unaffected expression didn't applaud it either. Dev offered her a cracker to prepare her palate for a different selection. She munched it demurely, then took the new glass he offered her.
"Marius couldn't resist human women, even more so than Nail," Dev continued. "Marius used to say he enjoyed the freedom, the fact that he never risked a mating bond with a human."
"Unlike a Nephilim," Nahiri added. Although the Incubi and Nephilim were opposing races, they were also dependent on each other for continuing their lines. In an odd demonstration of cosmic balance, offspring were born only to an incubus Nephilim joining. Without the Nephilim, the Incubi houses would all eventually perish. Without the Incubi, the Nephilim would cease to exist. The harem helped ensure that balance was met with sanctified regularity. It also helped avoid the added complication of the mating bond, which formed if a pair made love together a total of 8 times. The bond was eternal, unbreakable, and there were few incubi willing to entrust their sustenance and all of their future progeny to a single Nephilim. Over the eons, only a few Gravoris had taken Nephilim as their bonded mates. For the rest, Dev included, in order to keep the Gravori line intact, a visit to the harem was required. Dev had successfully avoided his call of duty for a couple of centuries. He thought of Marius and the harem-born son he left behind.
"I keep trying to make sense of the slayings, but there is no sense in it."
Nahiri stared at him in silence for a long moment. "A killing like that would only happen if a law was broken. A very high law, and no blade would carry it out unless commanded to."
"Marius broke no laws. And what about the woman he was with that night? Why kill her along with him?"
Nahiri frowned. "The 3 do not approve of sexual relations between incubi and humans. In the old times, it was forbidden."
Dev scoffed. "An old law that went extinct with the last succubus a very long time ago."
"Those offspring between humans and incubi were an abomination," Nahiri said, no doubt quoting from the teachings of the 3.
"They were sisters to my kind," he said.
They were female sex demons and very powerful beings, some of whom had incited an ancient war between the demon realm and the Nephilim.
"Nature seems to have taken care of that problem for everyone. There hasn't been a successful incubus-human breeding for as long as I can remember. As for Marius, he did nothing to deserve that kind of death. He was a good man, a good father to the son who hardly had the chance to know him."
"A son?" Nahiri asked, her voice soft, compassionate. She'd taken one sip of the second wine now, licking her lips as she swallowed. She took another sip, nodding her approval. Dev lifted a brow, pleased. He reached for another bottle and gave her a fresh glass while he tasted the one Nahiri had enjoyed. He liked it too, if only for the way it pleased her. And as much as he didn't want to admit it, he was finding Nahiri easy company. Too comfortable, considering that just the day before she'd been standing off against him, wielding her daggers on behalf of the 3. He didn't want to think of her as a woman first and an enemy blade second. But seated beside her on the leather sofa, sharing wine and conversation, Dev had to acknowledge the danger here. He couldn't hold on to his fury about his brother's death when he was with Nahiri. He couldn't blame her for it, simply because of her connection to the ones who killed him. Worse than that, he couldn't deny that he liked Nahiri, in spite of everything that stood between them. And that on its own was the more troubling danger. Dev cleared his throat, wrangling his thoughts back to his brother. The boy's name is Kai. Marius sired him in the harem 5 years ago. I was born in the harem too, Nahiri murmured, setting down her glass. She had abandoned the new vintage for the one she'd liked better. My mother is still there. She's happy living in the sanctuary. Dev couldn't pretend he wasn't interested in Nahiri's background, the things that made her who she was. And your father? He said, reaching to pour them each a fresh serving of the second bottle. Do you know him? She shook her head. I never met him. I heard he died not long after I was born. He was from the house of Akana, one of the last of his line, from what I understand. Dev acknowledged the now extinct house with a grave nod. Akana was a strong house. They were known for their skilled warriors. He could see Akana in her now, the dark eyes and exotic beauty. Not to mention Nahiri's accomplished position as the highest-ranking blade in the temple. Akana was an honorable house, he added, in case she wasn't aware of the good in her incubus father's people. It's too bad theirs was the first incubus line to die out. I'd have rather seen Marakel go that way first. Nahiri all but choked on her wine. You're speaking of the sovereign. You shouldn't say such things about the one seated on the obsidian throne. Dev shrugged. I never wanted their house to have the throne, and I'm not afraid to say that to anyone. Imithus Marakel is no ruler. If it had been up to me alone, I would have put any one of the other houses on that seat. You're too young to know this, but it was supposed to be the house of Romarak in power now, not Marakel. Kanan Romarak would have been the best choice by far, if he hadn't abandoned his house with no explanation centuries ago. Dev took a drink of wine, scoffing as he set his glass down. Hell, I'd gladly take the lethal spies of Xanth over Marakel now, or even Vipra's barbarians with their twisted passions. Marakel is weak, and there are others in power around him who know this. The question is, who has the sovereign's ear, and what will his weakness cost us all in the end? Nahiri regarded him warily over the rim of her wine glass. The sovereign has power, but it's not without limits. The three will ensure the balance. Will they? They always have, she replied, resolute. But despite her devotion, Dev saw the smallest flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She shook her head as if to scatter her doubt. Anyway, I'm glad to be removed from all of the politics. I'm even more glad to be removed from the obligation of being chosen for the harem. Dev nodded, aware of the exclusion of blades being sent to breed in the sanctuary. Still, he was curious to know more about Nahiri. Most Nephilim consider it a great honor to serve in the pleasure palace. Most, she agreed, but not me. It would have driven me mad. Lazing around on silk cushions all day, with nothing to do but primp and weave flowers into my hair, batting my eyelashes at every incubus who swaggers in, and praying for the chance he might debauch me so I can give him a child I might never see again? No, thank you. Harem life wasn't the oppressive indenture she described, but Dev was too intrigued to contradict her. Instead, he listened with rapt interest to the way she spoke so freely with him now. Her candor was partly due to the wine, no doubt, but she was relaxing moment by moment. Her guard had come down, and it was clear she was feeling as comfortable with him as he was with her. Dev stared at her, mesmerized by her sweet mouth, and by the way she looked at him with those soulful, fathomless brown eyes. He couldn't keep himself from reaching out to tenderly stroke the back of his knuckles along her soft cheek. She drew in a shallow breath at the uninvited contact, but she didn't pull away. Dev's voice came out thick and rough with desire. "I'm glad to know the harem will never have you, little blade." A woman like Nahiri would have been in high demand, and the thought of other incubi touching her, lusting for her, annoyed him deeply, aggressively so. For fuck's sake, what was he doing? More to the point, what the hell was he thinking, letting himself feel any kind of jealousy or possessiveness toward this woman? Need swamped him, swift and fierce. Heat raced through him, settling uncomfortably and quite obviously between his legs. He shifted on the sofa, for all the good it did. He poured himself more wine and downed it in one savage gulp. If he was smart, he'd put an end to this right now. There was still a chance to clamp the brakes down on what he was feeling for Nahiri. Time enough for him to rein in his temptation and deliver his pretty prisoner back to the villa. Better yet, back to the temple where she belonged. He felt her gaze on him. It was as warm and tender as any caress. "I'm sorry, Dev," she murmured gently, "about what happened to your brother and the woman he was with. I'm sorry for your loss." He swung a hard look at her, wanting to refuse her sympathy with a harsh remark or a cutting accusation for the trio of priestesses she served. But he couldn't do it. The sound of his name on Nahiri's lips had done something to him. All the worse after the time they'd spent here together, getting to know each other as a man and a woman, instead of the vengeful incubus master and the devout Nephilim blade. Dev wanted to feel animosity toward her. He wanted to cling to the rage that had sent him to the temple in the first place, the same rage that had made him seek to inflict some measure of his grief and pain on the three by taking something that belonged to them. Maybe there had been a part of him that thought he'd find some sense of justice in sullying their finest weapon, their brightest blade. But not now. He couldn't get a firm grasp on any of those malicious intentions when Nahiri was looking at him so openly, so trustingly. His gaze fell to her parted lips. His heart pounded with the urge to crush her mouth beneath his. "I want you, Nahiri." The admission was as dark and unapologetic as he felt. "I've wanted you from the moment I saw you in the temple." He hissed out a curse. "I want you so damned bad right now. It's all I can do to keep from letting the demon side of me loose to enthrall you, if that's what it will take to have you naked beneath me." Her eyes widened, but she didn't flinch. She didn't move away from him or his carnal warning. "I thought you had plenty of other women at your disposal," she said. "Willing women you don't have to persuade with incubus magic?" He smiled, taking far too much pleasure in the fact that his boast struck a nerve in her. "What are you really asking me, Nahiri?" She plucked at a tendril of her long, unbound hair. "Do you have a mate, Dev?" "No." She glanced up at him in question. "A lover?" "No lover who means anything to me," he said. And not a single name or face even came to mind when he was looking at Nahiri. She was tipsy from the wine. He could see it in her dark eyes, and in the relaxed, curious tilt of her head as she studied him from under the thick black fringe of her lashes. "I suppose you prefer a stable of thralls, eager to satisfy all your needs instead?" He smirked. "Are you volunteering for the job?" "Never." It was a quick reply. Too quick to be a true denial. She was looking at his mouth now, her pink tongue darting out to moisten her lips. It was all the confirmation Dev needed. He leaned in and caught her nape in his palm, dragging her close. Then he took her mouth in a hungry kiss. Chapter 7. Nahiri had longed for his kiss from the first instant she'd seen Devlin Gravory. Her initial craving had been all his doing, the blast of seductive energy that had rolled into the temple along with him, making every Nephilim in his path feel the urge to strip off her clothes and beg for him. Later, after he'd brought her to his island citadel and declared her his hostage, she'd craved his kiss all on her own, shamefully, undeniably, powerfully. During her time with him today, she'd begun to desire Dev in a whole new way, with a need that staggered her. And now, as his mouth crushed down on hers in a deep, masterful kiss, she realized she was about to cross a threshold from which she might never return. She wanted more of him than just his kiss. She wanted all of him. There was no resisting the hot demand of his lips, no denying the dizzying sweep of his tongue as he tested the seam of her mouth, then plunged inside. His kiss was scorching, ferocious, as devilishly seductive as the man himself. Nahiri had no defenses now, and no wish at all to make this dangerous moment stop. Overcome with sensation, melting with erotic pleasure, she speared her fingers into Dev's silky black hair, holding him close, surrendering her mouth, her entire being to his command. He pressed her back onto the blood-red leather cushions, then moved atop her as his kiss delved deeper, hotter, more hungry by the moment. Nahiri moaned, her spine arching up to meet his hard body. She couldn't get enough of him. Couldn't get enough of the delicious friction of their hips, where the thick ridge of his sex ground profanely against her mound. Some thin shred of sanity warned her that as good as he felt, he was still her captor. It could be a costly mistake to trust him. "What are you doing to me?" she managed to whisper. "Dev, we shouldn't—" He lifted his head, only far enough to meet her pleasure-drenched gaze. He stroked her cheek, strong fingers caressing her with infinite tenderness. "No, we shouldn't, Nahiri. I damned well shouldn't want you like this. But I do." She closed her eyes, sighing at the pleasure of his touch. "It's wrong." "It's real." He lifted her chin, imploring her to look at him. He shook his head, exhaling a curse. "What's happening here is real, whether either of us wants to admit it or not. And if you want me to stop, by everything holy, you'd better say so now." The words wouldn't come. She searched her soul for the will to reject what she was feeling, to convince herself that it was only demon magic that had her so enthralled with him. But Dev was right. This was real. And she was lost to him. She drew him back down to her. His answering growl vibrated against her, a sound so raw and masculine it made everything female in her coil in eager response. Dev kissed her again. Moaning deep in his throat, he plunged his tongue into her mouth and ravished her lips. His hand began to roam over her breasts. He slid his fingers into the low V of her dress's bodice, fondling her nipples, which beaded tight and aching under his touch. He tore away from her mouth on a snarl. Moving lower, his dark head dipped down to kiss her breasts. As he suckled, Nahiri went boneless, pleasure flooding her. Just when she didn't think she could take any more, Dev came back up for another kiss. His hand lifted her long skirt, his warm palm skating up her bare thigh. Nahiri gasped, trembling at the feel of his touch skimming toward her sex. He found her in that next moment, his fingers waiting between her folds. He groaned against her mouth, his voice nothing more than a rasp. "Ah, fuck, Nahiri. Your pussy is so soft and wet and hot. All for me." His raw words had the same effect on her as his questing fingers. Her vision started to blur as he stroked her, sensation racing through her like electrical charges. Each caress and tweak made her pleasure ratchet tighter. Her desire coiled taut, on the verge of a delicious explosion. Dev kissed her deeper now, his fingers toying with the tiny nub of her sex, making her wild with the need for more. "I want to be inside you," he murmured thickly. "I need to be." His fingers slipped through her wetness and into the tight entrance of her body. He penetrated her slowly, but deeply. Nahiri's body went molten. Although she was a virgin, there was no pain for her kind, only pleasure. And the measured thrusting of his finger inside her only made her long to know the fullness of a true joining with him. She moved in time with his strokes, unable to hold back her whimper of mounting arousal. "Please, Dev." His rhythm slowed, then he eased out of her. She cried out in protest, lifting her head to find him bringing his fingers to his mouth. Her moisture glistened on him. He licked it away, his gaze locked on hers in sensual promise. Sweet as heaven," he murmured, looking dark and demonic and so very wicked. He peeled off her dress, baring her to his brilliant citrine eyes. When she was naked, spread out before him, he smiled. "And sexy as sin, little angel." He was still clothed, the front of his black suit pants tinted at the front. Nahiri couldn't look away from him. She quivered in anticipation, wanting to feast her eyes and fill her senses with him too. Dev arched a brow, grinning as if he could read the wanton direction of her thoughts. He took hold of her ankles and pivoted her on the sofa. Sitting at the edge of the soft leather, she could hardly summon breath as he reached down and spread her legs wide before him. "So sweet and sexy," he growled, his hot gaze taking her in. "I want to eat you up." He sank down between her thighs. His dark head descended on her core. The instant his mouth touched her, Nahiri arced up on a jagged cry. He caught her hips, holding her steady beneath him as his tongue licked her cleft in maddeningly erotic strokes, from the swollen, throbbing pearl at its crest to the tight rosebud nestled between her cheeks. Pleasure poured into every cell in her body. Her senses lifted, rising higher, then higher still. Dev kept on suckling her, and soon that rising pleasure began to concentrate and build. It exploded, bright white, brilliant. She gasped a sharp scream of ecstasy as Dev's mouth sent her soaring, weightless, utterly free. As she slowly drifted back down into her skin, she found him looking up at her. His mouth still moved over her sensitive sex, but tenderly now, gentling her descent back to earth. "You were right," she murmured, panting. Her body was still electrified, shuddering with aftershocks. "What you told me in the helicopter earlier. There are other ways to fly." Dev's grin was devilish, one dark brow notched over his gleaming eyes. "Angel, we're only getting started." Her sweet taste lingered on his tongue as he rose from between her creamy thighs. He had no patience for his clothing now, stripping it off with rough, careless hands while Nahiri watched him. He stood before her naked, his cock stiff and upright, the heavily veined shaft on fire, its swollen, blood-engorged head weeping with the need to be buried inside her. She reached for him, and he obliged, moving forward until her slender fingers wrapped his girth in a warm, tentative grip. Curiosity shone in her dark eyes, amazement in the soft gasp that slipped from her parted lips. Dev steeled himself for her exploring strokes. His legs spread slightly, hands fisted at his sides. He had to focus just to stand there and breathe as Nahiri traced her fingertips along his length, then through the clear bead of moisture that oozed from his tip and ran down the underside of his cock. When she leaned forward to press her mouth to him, his blood spiked as though he'd just been hit with a bolt of lightning. The demon in him snapped awake with hunger, urging him to feed. He'd been careful with Nahiri so far, not wanting to scare her off with the siphoning energy of his incubus nature. But it was no small feat to keep the demon in check while she caressed him, kissed him, making him ravenous for her in every possible sense of the word. On a snarl, Dev drew her away from him and eased her back down onto the sofa. He followed her there, covering her gorgeous body with the tense, muscled bulk of his. "I can't wait any longer," he muttered, then took her mouth in a savage kiss as he guided his cock to the slick cleft of her pussy. Her heat engulfed him, and he slid home with one sure thrust. "Ah, fuck. This right here. This is heaven." She moaned as his hips found the perfect tempo. He guided her long legs around him, an unspoken instruction for her to hold on tight while he gave his passion free rein. He pumped into her in a frenzy, never having known such a ferocious need for any other woman. This woman, this Nephilim he'd known less than a day, the blade he should despise on behalf of all her kind, instead had turned him inside out. Less than a day with Nahiri, and he wanted to possess her. How much longer before she owned him completely? Dev roared with the realization of how fast he was falling for her. His hunger swelled, need overcoming him. He rocked against her, merciless as he watched another orgasm rise up to take her. "Come for me," he rasped. "Do it now, Angel." She screamed as the pleasure swamped her. Dev soaked it up, unable to keep from drawing her sexual energy into him as his own climax rolled over him like a tsunami. The sweet honey taste of her juices was like nectar in the back of his throat. The even sweeter force of her orgasm fed the demon side of him, all of it proving too much to bear. Dev plunged deep, his entire being gripped by the power of his own release. He never spilled his seed inside a lover. Not any of the humans he'd seduced over the years, and most definitely never with a Nephilim. Not once, not in centuries of living. And yet, he couldn't stop the flood of heat that rushed through him now, a racking wave that exploded out of him as he buried himself to the root in the tight velvet glove of Nahiri's womb. He swore viciously, shouting with the intensity of his orgasm. And even after he was spent, Dev couldn't summon the will to withdraw. He couldn't keep his hips from pumping into her, nor his cock from rousing right back to life, ready to do it all over again. Had he told Nahiri this wasn't wrong? Christ, what a bastard he was. Because real or not, right or wrong, he knew this thing between them could not continue. He couldn't allow it. He had to send her back to her home, back to the temple where she belonged. And soon, before he took anything more from her. Chapter 8. He seemed different after they had freshened up in the tasting room's private bath and were dressed once more. Nahiri couldn't decide what had changed in Dev, or precisely when, but their conversation in the time after they'd made love had taken a markedly less familiar turn. Gone were the questions about her past and her life at the temple, and his replies when she attempted to engage him were perfunctory at best. There were no more intimate glances or tender, seductive caresses. Dev still looked at her with hunger, but there was a sharper edge to his gaze now. There was reservation in his golden eyes, darkly troubled contemplation in the flat line of the sensual mouth that had given her so much pleasure just a short while ago. She had asked him if she'd done something wrong, but he denied it with a stern scowl and clipped words that hadn't done much to reassure her. For the past several minutes, he'd been talking in private outside the tasting room with his brother, Nail. The two Gravori men stood in the hallway, conversing in low, serious voices. Every now and then, Dev sent a grim look her way as he and Nail spoke. Nahiri couldn't pretend his sudden distance and grave regard didn't put a lump of coldness in her chest. She felt his abrupt detachment as if a wide crevasse had opened up between them. It confused her. Wounded her more deeply than she might have imagined. Finally, the Incubi brothers finished talking. They both strode into the room where she waited, feeling awkward and out of place on the sofa where she'd given Devlin Gravory her virginity. She'd given him a piece of her heart today, too, if she were being honest with herself. And yet she couldn't deny that she felt a bit used now, looking into Dev's impassive face when her body still thrummed from the intensity of their lovemaking.
Nail will take you back to the Citadel, Nahiri.
She glanced at his handsome, sandy-haired brother before looking back into Dev's sober gaze. What about you? He gave a small shake of his head.
I have things to settle here. It could take a while yet. You go on ahead of me.
She cocked her head at him, eyes narrow. Aren't you concerned about leaving an enemy blade in your house without you there to ensure your family's safety? His mouth flattened in a wry, regretful smile.
You're not the enemy, Nahiri. You never were, and you never will be.
But she wasn't a part of his house either. Not a part of his family. Nor would she ever be. A bitter thought. An unfair one, too, perhaps. He hadn't made her any promises, after all. She had been the one who let him into her heart. If she'd walked willingly into an incubus trap today, naively trusting that she wasn't just one of Devil Gravory's stable of willing thralls, then she had no one to blame but herself. She didn't want to believe the worst of him, but she also wasn't fool enough to think this wasn't some kind of goodbye.
Go with Nail, he told her. I'll be back at the villa in a few hours. We'll talk then.
The gentleness of his voice made it clear to her. He regretted what happened between them today. He told her it wasn't wrong, that it was real. And now he was looking at her as though he wished he could call the words back. The hurt of his rejection sapped all the moisture from her mouth. She had no voice, which was probably the only thing preventing her from making an even bigger fool of herself in front of not only Dev, but his brother, too. Praying he couldn't see her wounds through her eyes, Nahiri nodded, then followed Nail out of the room. Dev stood on the threshold behind them, watching her go. Watching, but making no move to stop her. Nahiri tried to tell herself it was for the best if they kept their distance from each other. She needed to remember that she wasn't his lover. She wasn't even his guest. She was his prisoner. At worst, she was merely a pawn to him, a piece he'd swiped and would keep until he decided he no longer needed her. Those troubled understandings followed Nahiri for the duration of the flight back to Gravory House. She didn't look at the breathtaking scenery this time. She sat numbly in her seat, staring straight ahead and wondering how she'd allowed herself to feel so strongly for Dev. It was worse than that, in fact. She was falling in love with him. Maybe she already had. The realization astonished her. It had happened so quickly, and taken root so deeply. But her entire being had responded to him as if it recognized he belonged to her the moment he walked into the temple. She couldn't blame it all on incubus allure, as much as she might wish to. His brother had no such effect on her. She felt his innate power emanating from the cockpit, the same way she might notice the thickening of the air before a storm. With Dev, he was the storm. He swept her up, twisted her inside out, left her breathless and trembling. Heaven help her, but he would leave her crushed and broken if it turned out that today meant nothing to him. And if it turned out that she meant nothing?
Here we are,
Nail announced from behind the helicopter's controls, dragging Nahiri's thoughts back to her surroundings. He touched down lightly in the villa's courtyard and killed the engine. "I suppose you've been ordered to put me back in my cell now?" she asked. Nail shook his head. "You're not Dev's prisoner. Not anymore. He said you can make yourself comfortable anywhere in the villa you like. We'll leave for the temple after he returns." "The temple." She went very still as the news settled over her. He was letting her go. No, he was pushing her away. Back to her old life. Back to the place where they would never see each other again. "You didn't know," Nail ground out. "Son of a bitch. You mean he didn't tell you?" She couldn't speak. She fumbled with the complicated set of buckles on her seatbelt, then burst out of the helicopter as soon as she was free of the restraints. She took off running, into the maze of gardens and tall hedges. Nail didn't follow her. He had to know she wouldn't want the company. He probably saw the misery in her face and preferred to steer clear of the tears that were sure to start falling any second now. She didn't wait to find out. Ducking down one twisting passage, then another, Nahiri soon found herself deep within the garden maze. In a small elbow of the labyrinth, she came upon a stone bench and plopped down on it, her face sagging into her open palms. What an idiot she was. What a gullible fool. Her heart ached, throat burned. Her vision swam with hot, welling tears. "Did you get hurt?" The child's voice sounded from just a few feet away. Nahiri looked up and met the concerned, inquisitive face of a lovely little boy. An incubus, although he was easily a couple of decades away from maturing into his demonic powers. A mop of pale blonde hair drooped into his eyes and fell around his seashell-pink cheeks. He held a large red ball in his arms, his breathing rapid as if he'd been racing through the maze, too. She sniffled and wiped the moisture from beneath her eyes. "I did get hurt, but I'll be all right." She managed a genuine smile for him.